Due to the following CBS School Break special, Magnum PI will not be seen today. It will be broadcast tomorrow in the regular time period.
Word Balloon is brought to you by the League of Word Balloon Listeners.
Now available to order at your local comic shop, it's Sal Abenante's new graphic novel, The Hostage.
Hostage is set in the streets of Rio de Janeiro, based on the plight of the street children that live in the favelas. In the world of the graphic novel, being murdered daily, and the hostage is the evil spirit that is raised to avenge their death. Origins go all the way back to the indigenous tribes of the Amazon as the spirits that protect children, especially murdered children. The level of death that these kids have to endure every day. They have nowhere to sleep. They have no place to eat. They have to survive off of begging. There were nobody in capes that were coming to save these kids.
Pick up Sal Abenante's latest graphic novel, The Hostage. Order now at your local comic shop through Diamond's Previews catalog. Code DEC221534.
Wow.
Welcome back, everybody. Oh, I appreciate the wow, Danny. Thank you.
That was that montage, and that graphic novel looks cool too.
I appreciate that, man. Thank you.
How
Absolutely.
Brazil is in the news, so it's very topical.
Indeed. Absolutely. Thank you very much, and thank you, everybody, for joining us on another Word Balloon Live, the comic book conversation show. John Suntress here. Always happy to welcome Danny Fingeroth back. Good reason to have Danny on. Late December, we celebrated the Stan Lee Centennial, 100 years since his birth.
Yeah,
and you see it in the background, but I got a great picture of it here.
Okay.
Danny did his marvelous life biography of Stan.
Thanks.
And it's excellent, and wanted to talk to you about that. Fantastic book. I think you provide a lot of insight in the man, and I really appreciated some of the tidbits that I learned from the book that I didn't know before. We all may think we know the story, and certainly, sadly, there was a very warts and all biography about Stan that came out recently, and also that really tragic AARP article about poor Stan at the end and the people that were really abusing him from
that was by the way, I also did the audiobook, so if you're an audiobook person, you can have me talking to you for 14 hours if that's your idea of a good time. You might want to break it down into a few different sessions. There's Stan had a bunch of warts. He was human, so it's always easy. It's always easy to take shots at somebody, especially when they're dead. I mean, that's sort of, the way these things seem to go is when somebody dies, they either become saints or demons. And I think look, 99% of people in the world know Stan as kind of that lovable old man in the movies and TV shows, and they're not that concerned with, with all the minutia, but a lot of people are, and it's an important story in terms of, people who create stuff and who gets credit and who doesn't, and
sure,
and what the behind the scenes stories were, and just how somebody came to be in that position. It's so I think there's kind of a backlash now that we're seeing of all warts all the time, and I think I'd like to think what I did in my book, in A Marvelous Life, is to present the warts, but not only the warts, and not put neon signs and dramatic Darth Vader music behind the warts, but just to say, here's this guy, we wouldn't have these characters and this Marvel Universe we love without him. We also wouldn't have it without his creative partners either. I mean, just how did that work? One thing I've sort of, as I've gotten more into writing about comics and pop culture and biography, I'm working on another one now we can talk about in a little while.
Oh, great.
You can sort of look at people and say, oh, that person was a ruthless careerist. But, if they weren't a ruthless careerist, we never would have heard of them. Unfortunately, it sort of kind of goes with the territory. And Stan, he did a lot of good stuff for people, not just the bad. He gave a lot of people chances, a lot of people opportunity, a lot of people work. Did he hog credit sometimes? Sure. Did he not make the best ethical choices? Sometimes, sure. But, overall, I think he had a pretty good track record for somebody working, the field of periodical publishing in an era when it was kind of I wouldn't say it was completely mob dominated, but there was a fair share of people who were not concerned with ethics.
You are 100% right, man. Absolutely. And God, especially across the street at National. I mean, a lot of those early, what became DC. There was a lot of mob influence and backing. And you're right about, I know that right now, obviously, he's kind of a disgraced author, but Gerard Jones in Men of Tomorrow, I think covers that era.
He did.
Quite fairly.
And that was fascinating, I mean, it's the thing that I always would hear from people about that book, which is a great read. And you're right, Gerard has made some missteps. People would say, 75% of that book is true and 25% is hearsay, but nobody would agree on which was the 75 and which was the 25. But it definitely puts it in context. It makes perfect sense. That a business like that where there's stuff moving in trucks and it's all in cash and and your audience is I guess the audience would I'd say the audience is children, just because kids are not, just people, the magazines are were and are such a big part of our culture, and and because of that, because it was throwaway culture, sometimes the people making this stuff got treated like they were throwaway people, and so a lot of that resentment ends up directed at Stan, say, because he was so obviously successful, but even he, there was, people do forget that Stan did not own any more of those Marvel characters than you or I do. He did very well as a staff guy, and even he sued Marvel. It's a complicated life, and he certainly had his flaws, but he did a lot of good stuff and helped a lot of people. And I kind of wanted to make that clear. I'm working now on a biography of a guy named Jack Ruby. Not Jack Kirby, Jack Ruby, the guy who killed Lee Harvey Oswald.
Yes.
Who may or may not have killed John F. Kennedy. It seems pretty likely he did, but of course, so I figured, gee, it wasn't tough enough. I wasn't going to get enough flack for diving in and doing a book about about the creation of the Marvel characters. Why don't I do a book about the Kennedy assassination? Because there's no controversy about that. So,
Danny, it came out 3 years ago, but I made it back in 2015. One of these reality magazine shows, and I had worked with them before on a show called Prophets of Science Fiction.
Right.
I did episodes about Isaac Asimov and Jules Verne and George Lucas, and they're like, "Hey, we're coming to Chicago," and I said, "How about the Kennedy connection to the assassination with the Chicago mob?" And they told me about, I don't know if you've ever heard of Plan A, but it was supposedly, again, conspiracy theory, but that they were going to try and kill Kennedy 3 weeks before Dallas in Chicago. I'll send you the link. It's
Oh,
an interesting.
funny. I had heard about a plan. I wasn't called Plan A, but I heard about a rehearsal or whatever in Miami. I didn't know about the one in Chicago.
That was Plan B. That was Plan B. And actually, I heard it was Tampa, but you're right.
Oh, maybe somewhere in Florida.
Definitely in Florida. No, you're right. And God, and I forgive the tangent, everybody, because also I want to get to some comments that have been made that were very flattering to Danny.
Yeah, please send me the links. I mean,
oh yeah, no, you'll love it, man. Absolutely.
Look, I mean, it's so easy to go down rabbit holes with the candidate. I mean, it's and not even crazy rabbit holes that are fairly reasonable or rational. And yeah, you can, and everybody. I mean, I'm trying to address all that, maybe similarly in a if you can in a balanced way, and more tell. I'm not going to solve the mystery, but I can tell a pretty good story about this weird guy and all this strange stuff that happened around him. So that's coming out, in the fall.
That's great, man.
The 60th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination.
Yes. My a good friend of mine worked with Oliver Stone and made that Showtime documentary that came out last year, Kurt Matella.
Yeah.
And I had him on. So no, you got to come back. And we'll talk about the Ruby book.
Yeah, there's a big Chicago connection.
Absolutely, he worked for Giancana, Jack Ruby.
Yeah, so, well, he worked. Who he worked for and who he didn't work for. I mean, all this. Believe me, there is, but he was, he grew up in the Maxwell Street ghetto, which no longer exists, but it was like kind of the Jewish ghetto of Chicago.
Oh yeah, my father grew up in that ghetto.
Oh, okay.
He's a Greek guy, but yes, he was.
He was a street guy, you said, or he wasn't?
No, he was a Greek guy.
A Greek guy, okay.
But his older sister, my aunt, would take me to the old Maxwell Street sale. Everyone still sells stuff, even in the 70s. It was still happening.
And Ruby was best friends with a guy named Barney Ross, who went on to become like one of the most famous boxers of all time.
Welterweight champion, absolutely, man.
Right, which sort of ties in with comics. I mean, it's funny because, of course, my late dearly missed friend Erwin Hazen got his start drawing boxers. And
yes.
there was a period when boxing was a very Jewish sport, and it's like in the 1920s. There were a couple of guys who weren't Jewish who pretended they were. That's how Jewish it was.
Max Baer wearing the Star of David on his trunk. So
that's Baer, of course, who showbiz royalty from his son, right?
Jethro, right? Jethro's father. I don't know if you know, and I don't know if it's legit or apocryphal, but God, I can't remember his name now. One of the old PR guys from New York used to tell the story that Max was in the gym training during the high holidays, the Jewish high holidays.
Yeah.
And they're like, Max, what are you doing? He's like, I'm getting ready for my next fight. And they said, but what about Yom Kippur? And he's like, I'll fight him next. So, but I want to show you these comments that we've gotten.
Okay.
Linkovich says, fan since the Dark Horse days. Dark Hawk days.
Dark Hawk days. Thank you. Thank you, Linkovich.
And, that's the last time Danny and I talked was when they were celebrating Dark Hawk's anniversary, and you wrote that new story.
Right.
Louise says, my 30-plus year hobby started with Dark Hawk. I still have those issues I bought at 7-Eleven and the local pharmacy. My first impressions were, wow, look at teen character with Iron Man-like armor and those 3 metal claws like Wolverine going against Soviet villains. Great memories.
Thank you. Yeah, Dark Hawk was lots of fun. And don't forget, he went to Midtown High in Queens, which where Peter Parker went.
Absolutely.
Same alma mater as that was one of my what movie did we knock off? There was a movie about terrorists taking over a high school.
Red Dawn?
Not Red Dawn. It was another one. It was maybe it was Red Dawn, but I don't think
it was from the 80s. I know that.
Yeah. So maybe it was Red Dawn, but I just found out today that one of my memories of my youth was totally false. So I have to double check anytime I say anything. I was very young, but I was at the Woodstock Festival, and I could swear that I saw Jeff Beck play there. However, I just found out But it turns out Jeff Beck did not play at the
Play
Woodstock,
Woodstock.
despite my memory. So
Well, there were a lot of other amazing artists that you saw. You
yeah,
know,
they were,
as,
and I
as
think
long as you didn't go, to see Sha Na Na, you're okay with me, Danny.
I did not go to see Sean and I, although I wish I had seen them. But yeah, but that's something they mixed around. And if you go by the movie, it looks like Sean and I like played early, but apparently based on the Wikipedia page. So, but apparently they played like near the end. They played like the last day, late in the evening, or at least late in the day. Which yeah, I'd left by then. I was too wet and cold, and my ride was leaving. So.
Wow.
But I'm not sure how we got to that, but
I loved it. What are you talking about? No, tangents are welcome. That's all right.
good.
What
Okay,
what
came
I
to the
love,
right place.
what I love about the book is, honestly, you uncover some things about him from a personal sense that I never knew about. I didn't know that Stan and Joan were good friends with Jim. Was it Jim Mooney, the artist that?
Mooney and Ken Bald, yeah. I think, well, it is a funny thing. I mean, and again, I'm not sure if this is like. I think Stan liked to hang around with good-looking people, and Ken Bald. If you've ever seen photos of Ken, even till he lived to be very old, but Ken was. Thank you, John. Ken was really handsome, and Ken's wife was an actress. She was a TV and movie actress, and same thing. Jim Mooney was also very. So I mean, I think Stan. I mean, he liked being around smart, funny people, of course, but he really liked being around good-looking people. And Mooney was he had a goatee. Mooney had that look of sort of a classic artist of the 40s and 50s.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, but yeah, Stan was. I think Stan had a lot of. It's funny. He wrote. Look, obviously his memoir, you have to read with a grain of salt, like anybody's memoir. But there is one chapter that just is basically him like listing all his closest friends. I mean that. There was nothing to be gained business wise from him like mentioning his accountant. Or you know. Yeah, no, yeah, they were very outgoing. They had a big social life. I think Stan had wanted to be an actor. I think that probably, and he just was very, he invented that Stanley personality. I think what that personality that started becoming public in the 60s was really who he was with his friends and family. Just there was no outlet. Before that, who cared what personality a comic book editor had? I mean, what did it matter?
Well, let's follow that because King Sport Cal says, "Was Stan always Stan? Did he ever need to be alone?" And I would say too, as you start talking about inventing, or at least what our perception was, inventing the Stanley persona starting in the '60s and being more of a front, as he would say, impresario, beyond just being
Yeah,
the editor in chief and writer of the comics.
I think he did. It's funny. One of my favorite things. I went to his house a couple of times in LA. I think that's one reason I was friendly with Stan. I was colleagues. We were fond of each other, but I would never consider myself part of his inner circle. So I think I could bring a certain amount of objectivity to the book that maybe if I was his best friend, I couldn't. But I do remember one time going to visit his house, and it was really like a very ornately. I think you've seen people seen photos, very ornately decorated, a lot of original art, and they had a Picasso and some other stuff.
Wow.
Right, a very fancy house. However, there was one room, the room where Stan did his writing, which was completely plain. It had paneling like a suburban basement from the 50s. And then these were the days of, I remember it was the dot matrix printer days. So Stan had his computer. He had a dot matrix printer that emptied out into a cardboard box. I mean,
Sure.
so that was the room. I think Jones said something like, that's the room where the money gets made, So, so everything else was like overdone the way, the way you would think a nouveau riche kind of house would look. But that room was just as plain as could be, and I do think he'd like to be alone, but not a lot. I think that's maybe why he never, even though he claimed he wanted to write a novel, I think he didn't end up doing that because that would have required too much time alone. And he was a real people person, and I think he enjoyed writing. Um, but in that way, a lot of writers do, sort of almost like exercise. Like, well, I'm glad I did it, but now I'm glad it's over. But I do think he put care into the writing and effort and attention. I think that shows. Um, but yeah, I don't think he was a guy who loved being alone. So that was a good question. That was an insightful question.
I want to acknowledge Alex Saviak is watching us.
Hey, Alex, good to see
So
you.
always good to see Alex. I hope to see him on the
Yes,
convention
yes,
circuit.
thank you. Anybody who uses the word young referring to me, I appreciate.
And Jared, thank you very much. Jared just signed up to be a Word Balloon subscriber via Patreon, and that's very kind, Jared. You say I'm doing the Lord's work. I'm just talking to people that I find interesting and getting great stories from people like Danny tonight. But I appreciate that, Jared.
It's always fun. It's always fun, and I thank you for censoring out the comments that say what a dope I am. So that
No. Everything's good so far, Danny. We're batting 1,000.
so far, that's
Well, I mean, come on. It is the internet. But there's an early story on, and really there are some incredible wrinkles in this book that I had no idea about, and I'll get to one of those in a second. But the classic question of when Stan was still working for Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, when they were making Captain America, when they started moonlighting at DC, you kind of present that question of, was Stan the guy that ratted him out? Did someone else? I mean, Martin Goodman ultimately fired them from Cap, and they made their full move to DC. But what's your take on it, and what you present in the book about it?
If people don't know the story, Simon and Kirby made a handshake deal with Martin Goodman that they would get a certain percentage of the profits of Captain America. But then they found out that Goodman was writing off all the other comics against, even though Cap was a big hit and a million seller, he was writing off his other expenses against it. So it was now it's what's called Hollywood accounting. So they didn't like that, and they started moonlighting at DC. They rented a studio where they go on their lunch hour and after work, and they'd work on DC stuff. And Stan was their assistant, so he followed them one day, and he swore he wouldn't reveal their secret. And then Goodman found out, and Kirby always blamed Stan. Simon wasn't so sure. Kirby thought, I mean, look, I don't know. Stan certainly would have been torn. Goodman was his cousin, However, if you know anything about the comic business, I mean, half the comics internet is devoted to gossip from the comic book business. I mean, there was no different in the 1940s. So it's a business full of people who want nothing else than to know everybody's secrets. So I think it's possible, although not likely, but I certainly can't deny the possibility that Stan ratted them out. But DC literally was promoting on their covers, Simon and Kirby are here. So maybe Goodman would have found out a month later. And Goodman also was a guy who prided himself on having a network of people to give him information. Martin, that was the name of the game in publishing, because if you had, he was constantly starting new titles and canceling them the second that it seemed like sales were down. That's why you see a lot of like first issues, but they're, debut issue or whatever, but it starts at issue 223 because the dark, mysterious Avenger had been Wacky Duck the issue before,
Sure.
Right? So, Stan, as a 19 or 20-year-old, wanted to curry favor with his cousin. I guess it's possible, but there was so many other ways for a guy like Goodman to have found out. And as I say, maybe, and whoever told him maybe jumped the gun by a month. I mean that. I mean, try to imagine, and there's no proof either way.
Yeah.
So, I look at, that Secrets Behind the Comics in the book that Stan self-published in 1947. And it's, a lot of it is drawn, it's sort of profiled. It's how comics were made, told from, from Stan, from the point of view of the editor of the biggest selling line of comics, which they were in the 40s. I mean, there's a whole story of how they then had a decline and then rebuilt as Marvel in the 60s. But
yes,
look, it's kind of almost painful to read that, because while Stan does tell a lot of inside secrets, he basically says that Martin Goodman created Captain America in it,
in that book. Yes.
In that book. And it's painful to read, because I get it. I get Simon and Kirby were no longer at the company. So maybe you don't have to mention them, but to literally say that Martin Goodman thought, on the other hand, he's a 25-year-old kid working for, even though it was quote unquote self-published, he was still on, the head editor at Timely. So it's a terrific little book. It's a fun read, and again, he gives this inside look and profiles of a dozen different artists and writers that nobody, Al Jaffe is in it, and
Oh wow.
Morris Weiss and Mooney. I forget. There's a lot of people who went on to be the various Marvel and Timely bullpens. But I think sort of the untold story that I get into a little, but I've since learned more in detail, is just how much that company was Martin Goodman's. It's because Stan used to make out that that it was almost a coincidence that he worked for Martin's company, but and I get why he would do that. But he claims he was hired by Joe that he had another, like every publishing company in existence at the time, it was a family business. Half the people working there were named Goodman, as was the case at all the other comic companies.
Sure.
So there was somehow another relative, I forget. They called him Uncle. It was Robbie Solomon. It was somehow related to Stan through his mother, and so he claims Robbie heard about this job at this company he worked in, and what an amazing coincidence! It was Martin Goodman's company, and that that he got hired by Joe Simon, and he ran into Martin in the hall, and Martin said, "What are you doing?" I mean that. But I mean, I think there are people who've started on biographies of Martin Goodman. I mean, the problem is, of course, who's going to buy a biography of Martin Goodman? Who's not even who's going to publish it, because these days you don't need a whole lot of capital to publish.
Right.
But who's going to put
who's
it?
Going to buy it? That's fantastic. Oh my God.
You and me and the people watching, but that and Goodman was a major force in pulp publishing and
yes.
periodical publishing. There's a guy named Michael Vasallo, goes by the internet handle Doc V, and he's got this incredible. He's made it his business to collect like every non-comic book Martin Goodman publication, and there's thousands of them. And they really, and I've had the privilege of going to Doc V's house and looking at this stuff, and it's horribly depressing, because it's the worst, with the exception a couple of times Goodman would really try to get classy and try to imitate Esquire. I mean, Timely that company named Timely comes from Time Life, like Time Life, like the Loose Empire, right?
Right.
That was Goodman's attempt to be classy. So there were a couple of publications that would have top name authors, fiction and nonfiction.
Okay.
But most of the magazines were just really just depressing kind of gossip and expose, and the half of the ads were for trusses. There were other, fix your hernia with this, bargain basement truss, or um, make they would sell like cement that you could make impressions of your own teeth from mail order false teeth. So these were not really high class or high end. This was not Vogue or Time or Life. But so reading those magazines can be very depressing. And in a way, the comics were actually a step up. That I think that partly it started with Simon and Kirby as being the editor and art director. I'd have to say Stan, I think, continued that tradition of getting the best artists, and having very slick, especially compared to, there were 1,000 comic book companies in the boom of the '40s, and I think the Timely Atlas ones had a look, that you can attribute to Stan and to Goodman, But I
They
think,
were nimble.
I think Goodman's involvement and influence on Stan in particular and on the company, I don't think he read every comic or looked at every one, but I think Stan learned a lot from him. And I think Goodman had 3 children, and 2 of them were clearly not interested in publishing at all. One went on to become a Jungian psychiatrist, and another, his daughter, became an artist. He had one son, Chip, and that's a whole dynasty saga in itself. The war between Stan and Chip when Goodman sold the company. But I think certainly when Stan was a kid, when Stan was just starting out, I don't think Goodman. I think Goodman kind of looked at him as almost a son, and it's because Stan's father was alive, but a problematic personality, very difficult to get along with, often unemployed, very moody. Stan always vowed. I think Stan's goal was to be nothing like his father, who he just remembered sitting at the kitchen table, reading the want ads and not getting the job. And he was a dress cutter, the garment business.
Yeah.
So I think Goodman became for Stan a role model, and Martin, I think trained him, and so I said, it would make sense that Stan worked for one company from the time he was 17 till the day he died. I mean, so that and that was obviously working for a big conglomerate is not the same as working for your cousin, but I think there is a certain loyalty. What's that Marx Brothers line? I trust him, but you got to watch him, or something like that. Like Stan trusted him. Yeah, he'd bring in the lawyers once, so he trusted them. But here's my lawyers.
Well, what I appreciated about Goodman, and I hear what you're saying, but he followed trends, and he was very, I think, mindful of, all right, well, this trend isn't working anymore. We have to shift. And I mean, certainly, after the superheroes started to die out post-war, we had the funny animal period at Timely and Atlas. And
but don't forget, at that point, Timely and Atlas, it started out, he was the pulp publisher, comic publisher.
right.
And he used that to get into all these other kinds of magazines. So by the time of the Marvel revolution of the 60s, it was just Marvel was a tiny part of this thing called magazine management.
Yes.
I mean, Goodman was very, and Goodman, he wasn't like Stan. He wasn't that big of a ham. But if there are some of those magazines where, like, oh, look, whoever, Audrey Hepburn or some Hollywood star is in town having lunch with Martin Goodman. I mean, who the hell? I mean, even the most devoted readers, I'm sure, are going, who the hell is Martin Goodman?
That's funny. I can think of another more recent publisher that made sure he's in every picture with the creators that he made books about. So yeah, I know what you mean. But it's funny, those men's adventure magazines that they used to make with those truss ads and those other really weird schlocky things. Secret Nazi spy rings still around, terrorizing women in their underwear, very lurid covers and things like that, and lurid stories for that matter.
And I guess the most famous people to come out of that were Mario Puzo and Bruce J. Friedman.
Yes, indeed.
Did you happen to see The Offer, that show
Oh
about the
yeah.
guy?
Oh yeah.
I really loved it. I
Yeah, it
get
was
what,
fun.
yeah, it was fun, and it was, some historical facts might actually have come through in the
Maybe a couple.
but I love the guy who played Puzo, was terrific, and I was really disappointed that no mention was made of him working for, even a line of dialogue. But
You're
that,
right.
but Puzo was famous for, well, I mean, he wrote a book before the Godfather. He wrote a children's book that was pretty popular. I forget the name of it. It's I talk about it in the book. I also talk about it in the book that Roy Thomas and I did called The Stanley Universe about 10 years ago. That was that's a lot of artifacts I found at Stan's archives in Wyoming. But it says something like, it's a very heartfelt dedication to Stan, and Puzo famous because they literally were, when Atlas Comics was like a single room within the magazine management offices, and so he was literally a divider away from Puzo and Goodman. Puzo wanted to make some money before The Godfather hit. He was always, I think, he always needed money, and so Stan gave him a few comics to write, and he came back and he said, "This is too hard. I got to go write a novel. That's easier. This writing these comics." um, but Puzo is famous for writing firsthand accounts of World War II battles that never happened. He would just I guess he knew enough history, probably like The Godfather, knew enough history to put it together
Sure.
and and make something plausible. But this, I guess, if you fictionalize it but claim it's true, you don't have to do a lot of pain in the ass research. And who's gonna? Very few people would actually, check up on whether it really happened or not. I kept hoping in that The Offer show that they make some reference, or maybe there'd be a character, who was Stan, who would show up. But I love those scenes of him and the guy who played a Coppola working together were very funny and but very warm. You could see they had a real affection for each other.
Oh no, absolutely, and I agree with you. No, The Offer is a lot of fun.
Yeah,
Just you realize you're not watching a documentary. You definitely are watching a highly fictionalized miniseries. But
yeah,
no, it's a lot of fun. I enjoyed the hell out of it. It was
yeah.
great. I saw Al Jaffe at the Society of Illustrators. I wonder if you were there that night, Danny. This was during one of the New York Comic Cons
Right.
10 years ago or so. Him and Blake Bell, and they had a ton of the Marvel pulps.
I was in the audience that night. I was not.
Okay, I was probably a couple rows behind you.
That was Michael Vasallo. That was for their book, for Blake Bell and Michael Vasallo's book, The Secret History of Marvel Comics.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Well, a lot of the same artists worked for the magazine, doing spot illustrations and yeah, it was
Covers.
yeah. I mean, that was, yeah, but it Timely, Atlas, Marvel, all had different names. They had different times. They were a dynasty story. The DC story is a dynasty story. The Harvey comic story. They're all these immigrant, family stories. And yet they created the pop culture that we know today. It's a kind of fascinating thing.
Isn't it interesting too that you can really see comparisons with Stan and Walt Disney in terms of the way that they were regarded, some of the warts and all stories that came out post death, but again, you can't deny the impact on the 20th century and certainly 21st century impact that
Yeah.
Stan has, and it's just like Stan. I love watching on Disney Plus these episodes of the Disneyland show, the original Wonderful World of Disney, these great black and white things where Walt's there with the map and he's showing you what Disneyland is going to look like and all these other little very interesting things. And that's kind of in the same way that I regard some of those old archival films of Stan talking about Marvel in the comics and everything.
The difference is, of course, that Stan, did not own the company. I mean, that's
Right.
He acted as if he did, and sort of it was his interest to do that. In his interest to do that, but he didn't. It wasn't his. So that's
right.
I think Goodman. They had a very complicated relationship. There's a New York Times piece from the Times Magazine in 1972. So it was a group. It was an article. Interviewed Goodman, interviewed Stan, interviewed Kirby. I think maybe they even interviewed Roy. I don't remember. It was sort of the state of superhero comics, 1972. And Goodman had sold the company, but his deal when he sold the company in '68 was he'd stick around for 4 years and still run it. So he hadn't gone off to start
The new Atlas.
the new Atlas yet. Atlas Seaboard, as it was called.
Yes, indeed, and that's where
Yeah.
Chip. That's obviously where
Yeah,
Chip was as well, ultimately. But go on.
And Goodman talks, even though it's 30 years later, right? It's if Stan starts there in late 39, let's call it 1940. It's 32 years later. He's still talking about Stan as if he's like his little cousin who came to work as an office boy and got lucky. I mean, it's so, look, maybe the writer picked that because he knew it would be the most provocative quote. But I mean, he's talking about Stan really as if he's still the 17-year-old kid who's sharpening pencils. Oh yeah, he did pretty well with
That's amazing. But then again, it isn't, because I know, working in the corporate structure of broadcasting,
right.
I know some managers that would still treat a person that was the office girl when they were working there and then went on to bigger and better things. And yeah, pretty much, yeah. Why don't you get me coffee like you used to? And so no, I can't say it's something that I haven't seen before.
No, me too.
So,
I know, it's, and whereas I think it's funny. I mean, that's, I would say one thing Stan, a lot of people, but one thing Stan certainly did was just the opposite. He was eager to see people rise in an organization and maybe take responsibility he didn't want. It's just like, but I never, there were a few times I edited his work, which was weird, but that was just he was writing a Spider-Man story or whatever, or when I worked for a company called Byron Price Multimedia, where he was also involved there. And since I was the guy who knew Stan, I worked with him on something called Rift World. But he never pulled rank or was condescending like that. I can't say never, maybe he did, but I mean that he certainly, I never had the attitude from him, that I was a junior partner and he was the great Stan Lee. It was just like, how do we fix this and make it better, or
cool.
That was yeah, I never detected that kind of an attitude from him towards me or towards anybody.
This is interesting, and I kind of know that he was less engaged with Marvel at this point, and maybe not. Maybe I'm wrong. But King wanted to know: do you think Stan freaked out when Image was formed? How do you know what Stan's take was? Obviously, for people who don't remember, mass exodus from a lot of the Marvel creators to form Image. I don't know if Stan had any thought on that. He certainly wasn't running Marvel at that point, but yeah, I don't know.
Well, as you may recall, at that point, Stan was hosting a cable TV show called The Comic Book Greats. And who were his guests on that show, aside from Will Eisner and John Romita? Who were Stan's guests on The Comic Book Greats?
I think somebody named Jim Lee, somebody
Jim
named
Lee,
Todd McFarlane,
Rob Liefeld.
Rob Liefeld.
You see, I don't think Stan had seen everything. He'd seen things come and go. So, and really, look, Stan wanted to be a Hollywood producer. I think he would prefer, or director or screenwriter. I think he would have preferred to do that without Marvel. His problem was that he didn't literally move to Hollywood until he was almost 60. I don't think he realized the ageism in Hollywood.
Sure.
So that everybody would take a meeting with Stan Lee, but then no deals would go through except for the Marvel characters. Right? I mean, there's a screenplay, I print some of it in that book that Roy and I did, the Stanley Universe. He, oddly enough, it wasn't just a showbiz friendship. He was really friends with a French avant-garde director named Alain Resnais, who made movies that really like very but he was a big, like a lot of directors that era, they were comics fans. Like I think Fellini came to Marvel, and I think he was disenchanted with Stan. I think he enjoyed it, but then he realized, Stan didn't draw these. But I think Alain Resnais and some other people like that. So honestly, I don't think Stan gave two shits about Image Comics, except as far as it affected his salary. I mean, I think he had just seen it all. He himself had been in that position, so
Sure.
I mean, and I got to hand it to the Image guys. I mean, they, for the most part, they might have treated it like World Wrestling Federation in press conferences, but they all loved Stan, they loved Jack, they loved Claremont and
Oh,
Byrne.
sure.
They weren't looking to destroy those people personally. They were looking to establish, they did a thing that, the comic book royalties have been in effect since the 80s, since like 1980. And so some people, the Claremonts and Burns of the world made a lot of money, but instead of starting their own company, they just, bought houses and did stuff that rich people do, or the, upper middle class people do. Sort of, but the Image guys, went, oh, well, we're not going to be hot forever. Let's invest this in ourselves and start a company. So I think Stan admired that. So I don't think Stan looked at it from a fan perspective, or even from a comic editor perspective. I think he looked at it from a show. I think he looked at it from a Hollywood producer perspective and said, "How can I get in on some of the action that these guys and the heat these guys have generated?" He had been around 100 blocks and seen things, and by that point he'd been in Hollywood for 20 years. He got how the game worked, and that especially with the company having gone through several generations of owners since Martin Goodman, nobody in ownership had a sentimental attachment to Stan Lee. So I get the question. I understand why you'd ask it, but I think you sort of have to put yourself in the position of a guy in his 70s who had been in the business since he was a teenager and was, there's a part in my book where I interviewed people, and there's some articles, and that period, Stan would have been happy to never read another comic book again. I think at a certain point, I think he realized, this is who I am, what I'm known for, what I've done, and I have to own it and run with it. But I don't think he had any sentimental attachment. He had sentimental attachment to people. I think there were people he worked with, he loved and felt
Sure.
very loyal to, and really valued and treasured. But I don't think he was that concerned with with the Human Torch or even the Thing. I mean, I think this was and it's hard for me to even wrap my brain around that, because I grew up with those characters. But they were a different thing. It was a different thing for him, especially by that point. But you can find those. I think they're on YouTube now. Those.
Yes.
The comic book greats. They're worth watching. They're worth watching just to see when he mentioned something about the Joker to Bob Kane, and you can watch Bob Kane's head explode.
That is a good one. Yeah, absolutely. King and Michaela point out too that in those interviews with McFarlane and Liefeld, he took a few little shots at them.
Oh, does he? Okay, well, they can.
So yeah, man. And Michaela even says too.
That's
he
interesting.
would imagine that Stan would have encouraged.
Yes.
The Image crowd.
Exactly. Because anything that makes, Stan, never stopped. He liked having executive salary, but I think he always did see himself in a certain way as a creator, and whether it was as a writer, a producer, or editor. So yeah, I think he just saw those people as making more opportunity. Yeah, it's funny. People look. Obviously, it was a shock to the system when the Image guys went away. But it really, I saw somebody the other day who said something like, I don't know. They had an interpretation of those events that were different than what I had, and kind of the company was hemorrhaging creators, and to a certain degree, but the creators that stayed were rewarded quite handsomely. I mean, Marvel then realized, boy, we better give these guys a lot of money to make the ones who are still here stay. So I mean, that was the whole crazy period in general. Just with the speculator boom and bust going on.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yes.
Marvel tried to copy Image. It's funny. I remember a well, I mean, Image was Marvel, right? The top Marvel
Yes.
creators Image. So with the looks, but I remember hearing about DC editors when Marvel. I was a kid, but hearing stories later on that DC editors would say, "Oh, there must be a fad for ugly art," because kids, our readers are stupid. They don't appreciate the great stuff, you know. Um, so we didn't do that, but I do remember a meeting of Marvel editors when Image started happening, and I remember us. We were literally, sitting there like holding them, going, "What is it? What do they got? What do they just?"
Dissecting the books. Yeah.
And of course, what they had was that raw power and energy that fans respond to.
Absolutely, man. Rob, you could not deny, much like in a
No,
different way, much like Jack Kirby, you could not deny Rob Liefeld's energy that
oh
he put
no.
on every page.
Yeah, you could make fun of a specific anatomy or whatever, but yeah,
Right.
he had that energy and that power. As you may recall, there was once an ad that we ran. It was like a big Hulk face and a fist, and I think the caption was "Marvel Comics is power." I mean, that's just
There you go.
yeah. So that's they had that, and they it was it was very smart because today, I mean, look, I mean, even Todd McFarlane bought those Barry Bonds baseballs, and everyone goes, "Oh, aha, he spent all that money." Well, he may have spent $1 million on the baseballs. He got $10 million worth of publicity.
Absolutely. And then he put him in a mobile museum that toured
Yeah.
the country and
Oh,
made a lot of
man.
money doing that.
Yeah.
Absolutely, man.
Oh, yeah. No,
Uh,
the guy.
so
Wonderful.
I'm curious going back, um, the period of Dr. Wortham. I think you do a very interesting chapter
Oh,
about the seduction of the innocent and that period. I had no idea that along with Wortham, was it Judith Chris,
Judas Priest. Yeah,
the
and
film critic?
I mean, it was fun. I mean, we have to give some props to Carol Tilley, the from Chicago, who was a professor in Chicago and a librarian there who did. She was one of the first people to do in-depth research into Wortham's archives. But yeah, Judith Crist, some of you may remember, she was a film critic on the Today Show and then TV Guide and locally in New York. And she was the one, if you know the Woody Allen movie Stardust Memories, that film junket that he goes on with all the surreal, film fans. That's based on Judith Crist's outings.
Oh wow.
Oh, thank you, Michaela.
Yeah, Michaela appreciates
Oh
this
yeah, so I found
chapter in
that.
the book as well.
So Christ had, I lived in the same building as Judith Christ.
Wow.
Um, so she was my upstairs neighbor. She's passed away about maybe 10 years ago. So in a way that was sort of weird because I wanted to interview her just about when I found out about her connection, but
Yeah.
I thought, well, is it inappropriate that we live in the same building and I don't want to seem like a stalker? So I gave a note to the doorman. I said, "Can you give this to Miss Grist?" And I see her in the elevator, and she thought I was some kid who grew up in the building like 40 years earlier, or she like, no, I'm just like a guy who happened to move in here. So she responded to me and she said, "I'll do an interview, but I want to do it by phone, even though we live 12 feet apart from each other." So it's fine. And it turned out to, I thought I would run the interview in alter ego, Roy was interested, but overall, it wasn't that great an interview, but there was enough really terrific quotes. And then when Carol did her research and this more became known, and then more became known about her relationship to comics and that interview she did with Stan, that was published. So she was a cub reporter. She was like a beginning reporter for the Herald Tribune, I think.
Herald Tribune, absolutely.
Yeah,
But she contributed to that critique of comics during that Wortham era, right? I mean, she really was on Wortham's side, from like.
Wortham was, and there's a very good book by I think Bart Beatty called Frederick Wortham. It's got one of those academic book titles, Frederick Wortham and the Something of Something. But Wortham was a progressive, very left wing, thought that comics were part of this sort of popular culture machine that was making people into like mindless consumers and creating juvenile, so he came at it a whole different way from most of the other critics who were very religious or conservative politically. But Chris interviewed him. So Wortham was a Jewish refugee, but he didn't come here as a refugee. He came here to study in the 20s. And then I think he realized, he saw the way things were going in Europe and decided, maybe I'll stick around. I don't think I want to go back to, I don't want to go back to Germany or Austria. So he was a refugee, but in a different way and from a different background than, say, the Eastern European poorer Jews who came here, with those big waves of immigration at the turn of the 20th century. That's it. That's the one. Exactly.
Michaela gave us the title of this book.
Yeah, it's well worth reading. Thank you, Michaela. Yeah, so
I'm gonna say it for the audio audience: Frederick Wortham and the Critique of Mass Culture by Bart Beatty.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the title, everybody.
Yeah. So Wortham, I'll tell a specific story. He just got to be in his bonnet. So comics are part of this popular culture thing, and and I've met. Although any video footage I've seen of him, he seems utterly charmless. Very. So he was an expert in he was a psychiatrist. He was one of the people who gave testimony in Brown versus Board of Education on behalf of integration. He was the psychiatrist to Ethel Rosenberg. I mean, the guy was
one of the Rosenbergs who gave
and
then the Soviets and got executed. Yes,
and when they were executed, he counseled their children.
Wow,
so, I mean, the guy but he fancied himself an expert in popular culture and in juvenile. And I have come across not just Judith Crist, but a couple of other, especially when I'd written that book about Jews and superheroes disguised as Clark Kent. The audiobook is now available, by the way, although it's out of print, but I did the audiobook on that and Superman on the Couch recently. So you can get it at Audible and all that. Anyway, I met some elderly Jewish ladies who you could tell they had crushes on Frederick Wortham. A couple of them, Judith Crist in particular, but a couple of others who would come to my talks. And I go, what are these old ladies doing here? Why is this 90-something woman coming to my talk about and I can say, oh, she's got a crush on Frederick Wortham.
Interesting. Pop culture intellectual. I get it.
Yeah. And he was he wrote for the Saturday Evening Post, and I know he was on TV at least in the 60s, so maybe in the probably on radio. He was he was an art critic. His wife was like, I forget if she was either an artist or a critic. I mean, they were this 1-2 punch of highbrow art stuff. And the comics, and then after comics, he took aim at movies. That was, he very much was like a Dr. Phil or some public intellectual. He I mean, when you think of the title of his book, Seduction of the Innocent, I mean, Bart Beatty's book is called Frederick Wortham and what was it called again?
Stand by. There it is, Frederick Wortham and the Critique of Mass Culture.
That's a name of an academic book, not Seduction of the Innocent is the name of a story in a Martin Goodman poem.
Exactly. When's that on Cinemax? I want to watch it.
Right, so he was hip enough to, so Wortham was hip enough to that to call his book Seduction of the Innocent.
100%, man. Honestly, Danny, thank God, and I'm glad you mentioned, because certainly over the years, you stumble across either film of Wortham or radio snippets. That amazing thing from New York Public Radio where they were at the juvenile delinquency Senate hearings about comics, and you can actually hear, William Gaines on the stand and everything. I mean, that stuff is amazing. But I'm so glad that stuff exists, and I always find it interesting that, and Stan was certainly like this as well. There's amazing radio of Al Cap just being this bright little I always refer to him as Charles Schultz with a personality, and I love Sparky, don't get me wrong, but Al Cap really milked the celebrity aspect of creating Lil
Oh yeah.
Abner
Oh yeah.
and commenting on pop culture in the strip, and really made himself this kind of panel discussion celebrity. Wortham certainly was like that. Stan certainly became like that. I also love those 60s attempts that Stan made to do a panel show and moderate a panel show, kind of leaning into the whole college kids getting into Marvel Comics. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, don't forget, in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, nobody's goal was to get into the comic book business.
Right.
You got into the comic book business because you had a certain kind of skill that you could use to make money with. But your goal, if you wanted to stay in sequential art, as Will Eisner called it, and I'll throw in a plug for Will Eisner Week coming up in March, which I run Will Eisner Week for the Eisner Studios. So if you have an event or want to do an event or I'm doing an event online with.
Is he frozen? He might be frozen, everybody. I'm assuming he's frozen. That's a long pause.
Yeah. Okay. How about now?
You're all right. You're back. Okay. You froze for a minute there, Danny.
Okay.
So you're going to do what kind of panel for the Eisner Week?
A panel on comics and censorship with Jeff Trexler and Dennis Kitchen and a whole bunch of other very interesting people. With Jeff Smith of Bone.
Great.
And New Kid. This is embarrassing. New Kid, like most popular comic graphic novel.
Renee Telgemeier?
No. A guy named. It's called New Kid.
Oh, I don't know.
Jerry Kraft.
Oh, okay, Jerry Kraft. Okay, everybody.
These are the comics that people are actually buying in the millions and hundreds of thousands.
Right, like Renee, absolutely, man. Yeah. We're the idiots that are still reading Marvel and DC.
Right.
Everybody else is reading the millions.
Not Renee. You mean Telgemeier?
Yeah.
Raina, not Renee.
Raina, not Renee. Pardon me, Raina. I apologize, everybody.
These are the comic books that actual children are actually buying.
Yeah, you're right.
So I'm doing this, but Will Eisner Week is an annual celebration of Will Eisner's legacy in comics and free speech and novels. So if you go to WillEisner.com, you can find out about that. And if you want to put on your own event, let us know and we'll publicize it and send you posters and stuff. How the hell did we get to that? Talk about digression.
I'm glad you mentioned it, man. No, I had forgotten that you were in it. We've talked about it before.
So the Wortham thing, yeah. So again, in the Stanley universe, but also you can probably find it online, is a debate Stan had with a woman named Hilda Mossey, who was Wortham's partner in research and comicating. And she's a first.
Oh, hold on. Danny will come back. I guess we're getting spotty internet. All right, Danny. Danny. Can you hear me? You were.
Yeah, I can hear you. I can see you. You've been freezing up all along a little bit. Okay.
I want to make sure. Okay. I'm checking my connection. Make sure we're okay. Would you mind starting again about Hilda?
Oh, Hilda Mossey was another refugee she was a refugee from the Nazis. Her family had a publishing company in Germany, and when the Nazis came to power, they seized it, and she fled to the U.S. And she and Wortham became research partners. And her brother George Mossey. This is really digressing, but he was like a famous intellectual, if that's not an oxymoron.
I'm asking in the chat if Danny is freezing or I am.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know. Okay, so Hilda Mossey was on this show called The Barry Farber Show, which was a syndicated show out of New York. And she and Stan had this like hours-long debate that there's a recording of at Stan's archives. And I had it transcribed for that Stanley Universe book. And I excerpt quotes from it in the biography. But here's a classic Stan thing. Stan would brag for years that he debated Wortham and had Wortham running out with his tail between his legs. He never debated Wortham. I think he went to a debate that Harvey Kurtzman had. No, not Harvey Kurtzman. He went to a talk that Wortham. He went to this thing. There was a symposium, a day-long symposium.
We'll get the story, everybody. Don't worry. I'm sorry that Danny's freezing, but he'll be back in a second. All right, maybe no.
How about now? Okay.
All right, now you're back. So you went to this symposium.
Psychopathology comic books that Wortham and Hilda Mossey put on at Columbia or NYU, and I think Stan might have been in the audience, but I don't, and Stan would just for years, and then finally he admitted, or just somebody got the transcript of the thing, that he never face-to-face debated Wortham, but he did face-to-face debate Hilda Mossey like years later on the Barry Farber show. And I'm sure maybe he debated other people at conventions or talks, but I guess who was gonna double check? I don't think anybody from comics ever literally sat on the stage with Wortham. I doubt Wortham would have allowed it. I don't think he would. I don't think Wortham wanted to have that kind of competition.
Pushback. Yeah.
There's a funny, maybe I don't know if it's on YouTube, probably, but I saw it one time when Marky Veneer showed it at San Diego. There was a video of Wortham on the Mike Douglas show with Vincent Price. I don't know how Vincent Price became the voice of popular culture. This is when Wortham was going after movies and TV. He'd written another book, and Price was doing pretty well, except he was so self-involved that he just got off topic, and kind of lost the train of thought. But for a while, he was doing a pretty good debate with Frederick Worth.
I'm going to have to look for this.
The weirdest thing, it's so funny to look at it now. Everybody is smoking on this show, like chimneys. It's like chain smoking cigarettes. It's like,
sure,
you can't see the people talking for all the smoke.
I remember. Go ahead.
No, nobody thought that was a bad role model, right?
Well, I remember in the 70s, and then, man, this is my, forgive me, everybody, Rain Man memory, but when Stan was on Mike Douglas one time with Joan Rivers and George Carlin.
Oh, yeah.
And at the end of the segment, they all dressed up in superhero costumes.
Oh, that's hilarious.
And Stan was wearing the Captain America costume, but he didn't wear the mask because he's like, the wings are falling off, so I'm not going to wear the mask. Joan Rivers was dressed as Wonder Woman, but I think was embarrassed by the costume.
Sure.
So she kept a cloak around her so she wasn't in the onesie.
That's
but
hilarious.
The best was George Carlin was dressed as Spider-Man, and in classic George Carlin he points to himself and goes, "The spider," and then he points to his crotch and says, "And the fly." And everybody laughs and everything. It was fantastic. And I think Mike was dressed as Superman.
What year was that? What
God, it was definitely like mid-70s. Definitely mid-70s. Yeah. But, it was when I love that the To Tell the Truth Stan is on. And, will the real Stan Lee please stand up?
Yeah, no, he was. Yeah, he was. I don't know if he was. He didn't have any training, but he did love acting and love. I mean, I guess his best role was being Stan Lee.
Sure.
But, and
always affable. Absolutely, man.
Yeah, and he made that character, and it's funny, even though, it's easy to make fun. Yeah, it's that he made up that thing about Wortham, but I think he, nobody forced him. Look, most of the Stan soapboxes were promotion, but there were enough things he took at least mild stands on, and that he didn't have, stuff he didn't have to. Did it sell more comics? I don't know. There was an interesting period, right, when sort of the beginnings of the 60s culture was happening in the late 60s, and underground comics hadn't happened yet. Crumb hadn't appeared. None of those people had appeared. And so hippies, for lack of a better word, or students were reading Marvel comics, and perhaps aided and abetted by various substances, especially Doctor Strange.
Sure.
And so you would see like the Country Joe and the Fish would name check Marvel characters, and even the Paul McCartney, and so maybe Stan to some degree was playing to that audience, which I think they did lose a lot of when the undergrounds finally happened. But I think he put himself out there in a way. He thought he could be like the Hugh Hefner of comics or something.
Yes.
which, one of my favorite quotes about Stan is actually from an old orthopedist of mine about a few, maybe 6 or 7 years ago. He was injecting something into my knee, but we were chatting. He turned out to be a comics fan, and and I was telling him about that I was working on this book about Stan, and he said, "Was Stan religious?" I said, he always said he was an atheist, but he did write a book, write an epic poem called "God Woke." And my orthopedist, the Dr. Mick, said to me, someone who has no interest in religion doesn't write an epic poem called "God Woke." So
Yeah.
I think Stan was full of contradictions like that. So that something in him made people want to think that he literally debated Wortham when he hadn't, and yet there's this 3 hours of him really holding his own with this Hilda Mossey, who was no slouch herself. Um, so it's that's it's a funny, like, Stan with credit too. Stan would. It's quite clear that a lot of what he did at Marvel was based on what the EC Comics did. That kind of palling around with the readers and the letters pages and making wisecracks and sort of making fun of that brilliant gift he had of making fun of the stories while not making the readers take the stories any less seriously. Right? He could make
Right.
fun of it, but so he would. You'd say to him. I think I even said to him, "So were you influenced by?" And he knew Harvey Kurtzman. They were like, Kurtzman worked for him. I mean, he knew all these people. I said, "So did you?" No, in the gang, they all knew each other. I said, "Did you take inspiration from what EC was doing?" He said, "No, no, I never paid any attention, but I did copy it from these books I read when I was a kid. They were a series of books. Jimmy, the Grace, Jimmy Dale, the Gray Seal. He would cite these serialized, like Hardy Boys type books he'd read as a child, where the author of those books would engage in kind of slow motion repartee with the readers.
Oh,
He would do a similar kind of thing to what Marvel did. So it was, Stan would never give credit to his competitors, even if but he would always say, "I got it from this thing, this obscure thing I read in 1930." Well, he probably did, but damn well that just like we were sitting there with the image books going, "How do they do this?" Right? That
sure.
he was sitting there with his staff going, "What are these EC books doing?" Right?
Well, yeah, and I mean, you even point out that obviously, Atlas and Timely came out with Crazy, and
Right.
some of the other humor books that clearly were mad knockoffs and
Yeah,
everything.
yeah,
So
Jer Appledorn has done great research on that. If you look up, he did a book with I'm forgetting, but Jer did a book about all the different mad knockoffs, including a lot of the Marvel ones. Yeah, they were all ripping each other. Or that was that's
sure,
publishing.
absolutely,
Look, that was the Marvel revolution. Was that for whatever reason, Stan and Jack and Steve and Martin Goodman, they somehow said we're not copying anymore. Now we're innovating. What makes that happen? How does that sort of collectively get into the brains of, like, of a core of people? That's the magic. That's the thing where they, where some of those stories, apocryphal or not, of his wife said to him this, or who knows, something happened to this guy as he was approaching 40. Where he and these other guys approaching, or maybe Kirby's maybe on the other side, went, "We got nothing to lose. Let's throw this shit against the wall and see what happens." And but that's no small thing, obviously.
agreed. Also, the I think the feedback that he was getting from the audience. I mean, the Hulk initially is canceled after six
Right,
issues, and then all these college kids are like, "Oh, the Hulk's our mascot and everything."
right,
So I
right.
think they were listening to their audience
I,
because, and I don't know, I didn't do the deep dive of everything that was coming out when Spider-Man was created, when the Fantastic Four was created, the Hulk, that initial first wave of the Marvel age. But how many books were like that, and also how many books were still traditional? I mean, you did have
From Marvel, you mean, or in general?
Yeah, and Marvel specifically, I mean, was it just everything moving forward, or I mean, obviously, Rawhide Kid and the westerns were still happening, and the War Book was still happening.
Right, but I think when Kirby came back full time, and look, Kirby had 4 children to support. Kirby needed to do a lot of work. Suddenly, the cowboy books and the fantasy books, and that was the same time Larry Lee, Stan's brother,
Right.
needs to make some money. So all these things come together. Ditko comes in, and I think the thing that people forget, because it's easy to say, it's easy to look at like Steve Ditko's later writing and go, oh, he must have, he and Stan must have always been in loggerheads. Stan was not hanging out with Steve Ditko like he was hanging out with Jim Mooney,
Yeah.
But there was a chemistry between the two of them where I think they really enjoyed working together. I don't know if that was ever true with Kirby. I have a feeling it might have been in the beginning, but who knows? There's a lot of water under that bridge.
Yeah.
But I think Ditko was 5 years younger than Stan. I think Ditko, in some ways looked up to Stan. I think there was just this sense of let's have fun. But they were still putting out like 2 million, 3 different Millie the Model books, 3 different cowboy books. But I think one of the things that Marvel did was Stan seemed to mostly, I think he enjoyed, and it was easy for him to write the humor stuff, the romance stuff, the cowboy stuff. I think he could just rehash what he was seeing on TV or reading in syndicated strips. So, and
all of his attempts to make syndicated strips as well during that period.
Yeah, he liked humor stuff. He liked funny stuff. And so I think that you could take a superhero. Again, what part of this is Kirby? What part? Right? If you were a kid reading Flash comics or Action Comics, you get 2 or 3 really tightly plotted stories with a minimum of characterization. The plot was it. Even if looking back on them now, the plots are absurd. Sometimes they're based on something to do with real science, which would maybe be Gardner Fox. But as often as not, there's some preposterous twist on quote unquote real science. God bless. I love those stories. I grew up on those.
Absolutely.
But somewhere in this combination, if only just to stretch out a plot for an issue or 2, suddenly there's all this characterization we'd never seen in comics before. Suddenly you could have a love triangle between Reed Richards and Sue Storm and the Submariner. And even at 9 years old, I wasn't into girls particularly yet, but I was like, something's going on here that I don't quite understand, but I'm not getting it in Superboy comics, right?
Michaela says, with Ditko and Lee, it feels like an unspoken camaraderie. With Lee and Kirby, I think all that history from when Lee was still a teenager did color how they viewed each other later. I love that one local New York.
But there's no law that says they have to like each other to produce great work together.
Oh, 100. Good Lord, yes, absolutely, man. Hey, I saw the Police's farewell tour,
right,
and they weren't even speaking to each other except for on stage.
Right.
And yeah, man, no, it was So no, I get it, man. You're absolutely right. I remember that, and it's on YouTube. It was a local radio station, and they were wishing Jack happy birthday. Maybe he was 70. I don't remember.
Yeah.
And then, hey, we got a surprise guest. Here's Stan Lee, and you just hear the air deflate from poor Jack, who was really having a great time. And it's like, hello, Stanley. Yeah, it's great to see you. Yeah, thank you. And it's just, it's sad. It really is.
But you can also see that Stan totally didn't get it, right? I mean, as smart as he was, he thought, like, how could Jack not be happy to have me there on his birthday? And the context of the station it was on, this was WBAI, which
is that public radio?
It was beyond public. It was Pacifica Radio. It was
Pacifica, sure.
It was the voice of the counterculture.
Yes, indeed. Absolutely. Very, very progressive, very liberal, especially back then. Yes.
Yeah. Well, in the 1980s, it was obviously it wasn't the 60s anymore, but even then it was. True. But I mean, that was its heritage,
Absolutely.
And so this was this show of there were no. it made public radio look like a corporate, corporate formula
Well,
broadcast. Right?
Pacifica was where George Carlin would go and be able to speak freely about, and I believe that's where they played the 7 Dirty Words.
But here's the thing: the Marvel offices were like 2 blocks from the WBAI offices.
Oh wow!
And they were, I mean, like like radio broadcasters everywhere, they needed to fill air. Whatever the content of the politics, they needed to fill airtime. Here was Stan Lee, who loved nothing better than being on the air. So there's a lot of early Bob Dylan just would show up on this guy Bob Fass's show, like he would just out of the blue. Thank you, Ed.
Ed Cato praising
Ed, I'm due to talk to one of your classes soon, Ed.
Oh, that's great, man.
I talk to Ed's classes regularly. I'm starting to feel Ed doesn't love me anymore because he hasn't asked me to come by. But thank you, Ed. If you're in Ithaca, you should take one of Ed's classes at the Ithaca College.
Ed's a regular Word Balloon contributor. Absolutely, man.
Ed is a great
guy, great ambassador to comics. Absolutely, man.
So so it was the perfect. Yeah, it was the perfect. I mean, they were literally there. The WBAI studios were on 62nd and 2nd. Stan lived on like 63rd and Madison, and Marvel was like on 57th. So if you know your New York geography, it's all within like a 7-minute walk of each other.
Sure. That's fantastic. Oh my God. Well, again, is any of that stuff that you and Roy put in the Stanley universe, is any of that stuff on YouTube? I mean, I'd really love to see that debate with Wortham's research.
I'm pretty sure the one of Stan hosting that
panel show,
that serious talk show is there.
Yes.
Just Google, Stanley and talk show. That's from '68.
Yes, I've seen that.
And a lot of, and I think most of the comic book greats
agreed about that. But I wondered about that debate that he had with Wortham's researcher.
I don't think that was not video. That was just audio. It's probably somewhere. I mean, I had to sign like an agreement that I wouldn't share it when I went to the archive. But
fair enough.
But if you contact the American Heritage Center at the University of Wyoming, probably for some minimal fee, they would make a dupe of it if you wanted to hear it or something.
Well, it's good to know.
And the transcript of it is in the Stanley universe. Look at the internet. So somewhere, probably all this stuff is somewhere if you look hard enough.
Hey, thank God for the tape hounds that were out there. And I mean, I remember, being an old time radio buff, all these great homemade newsletters where, we got 12 Have Gun Will Travels if you want to buy them from me or whatever. And now, thank God, with the Internet Archive, all that stuff, is more available than it was.
Yeah, the problem is not finding stuff; it's finding enough time in your life to actually. I mean, just to bring in this Jack Ruby book I'm writing. The problem with the Kennedy. It's funny. I was watching a Robert Caro. Robert A. Caro.
Of course, I love great historian. His LBJ books are amazing.
Right. And his book about Robert Moses and his motto.
Yes, indeed.
His motto.
Robert Moses. Yeah.
What's the name of that new documentary? Turn every page. Well, it's a great motto, and that's that's why it can be depressing to watch a lecture by Robert Caro because you go, oh man, he did turn every page. It's like I'm researching just the tip of the iceberg about the Kennedy assassination. And I mean, everybody makes fun of the Warren Commission report. It's easy to make fun of. However, there's still an 850-page thing that's just a report and 26 volumes of backup. So I mean, you can come up with your own conclusions and discount all their conclusions. And plus, every year they're releasing another million pieces of information, and people still aren't satisfied. And I get it; I understand why. Yes. But I mean, that's the thing about doing biography or history is not that there's a lack of material. It's like there's so much material.
That's fair. You're right about that. I also appreciate the way you wrote the Stan book, and I imagine the Ruby book will be the same way. Where a lot of times you'll end a chapter, and it makes you want to go to the next chapter. You kind of in that great comic book tradition. It's and little did Stan know that the next year was going to be the toughest year of his life.
Well, that's my
What happened?
that's my hardcore, Jim Shooter training, and and Larry Lieber training, and Louise Simonson, everybody. I mean, that was. But I feel like why not do that with? Because as you would imagine, I've read a lot of biographies just to sort of get the look and feel of what a. And there, you read some books about lives that are really interesting and exciting, but the biography is like a snooze fest. How could you do that? How could you take such an exciting life and make it so boring? So, because of my comics training, yes. I mean, sometimes that's a little, you want to have a cliffhanger, but not have it be, so forced. Little did they, you know, I don't think there's any spoiler alerts about the Kennedy, certainly about Jack Ruby. There's no, except, but it's funny, but because that's the thing. That's one reason I chose to write a book about Jack Ruby is because nobody really knows anything about him except that famous image or footage. But the guy's story, it had started out as a graphic novel project years ago with
Oh,
me and Rick Geary, and it may still happen, but
oh,
I decided to do it as a prose book, and Chicago Review Press is publishing it. But
fantastic.
but one of my taglines at one point was, "Killing Lee Harvey Oswald was not the craziest thing Jack Ruby ever did," and I mean, so the life, it just is an astonishingly crazy life that. And because, again, I don't want to trivialize it, but because, not unlike Stan Lee, Jack Ruby wanted to be famous, there's all these weird celebrity names that show up in the Jack Ruby story that you would not expect to be in this kind of low level mobster showbiz. There's stuff in this guy's life that if it wasn't that what he did was so serious and history changing would be funny, and it kind of but I mean the people I found out a lot of stuff I didn't like, that you know he he wasn't a cute lovable mobster. He was really a pretty horrible guy. So I ended up finding out some things about like the flesh business in Texas in the 50s and 40s that was really kind of stomach turning, but I guess it's good, because it's you watch enough TV and movies, and it's easy to idealize these guys and make them sort of gruff but lovable.
Sure.
But even whatever his relation to the mob and whatever good things he did, and he did a bunch of good things, he was still like a creep, but a very interesting creep.
Understood. No, absolutely, man. I'll tell you a Ruby story that I got from researching this Kennedy conspiracy story that I ended up doing on
And
TV a couple of years ago. But hey, Danny, I know you're under. Like, are you okay? Do you want to wrap up? I don't. I mean,
yeah, but I can do another few minutes. We can go, but I just
okay.
one thing I do have in the book. Like I said, I'm not going to be the guy to solve the mysteries of the Kennedy assassination. I'm sorry, I'm not Robert A. Caro, and I don't even think he has. But although he writes about it in a very interesting manner. But what I did do is I talked to like Jack Ruby's niece and nephew.
Wow.
I talked to the one of the sons of the owners of one of the other of the competing strip clubs. So I mean, imagine your name is Ruby. You live in Dallas. You're 12 years old. Sunday, your crazy uncle kills Lee Harvey Oswald on television. Monday, you got to go to school. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
so that's what I try to bring to the book, because I'm not the world's greatest detective. I'm not the Bruce Wayne setting his mind to solving the mysteries, but there's so much other weird, fascinating stuff and personal stories like that. Just that you don't think of. It's just like, oh yeah, what's it like to show up in school when your uncle just changed history? Right?
Well, and he's so well known for that literal one moment.
Yeah,
And you're right that I think the backstory. I remember Danny Aiello did a Jack Ruby movie in the
yeah.
'90s, or yeah, I want to say
But
the '90s.
but, but just like with JFK, and I mean, JFK tries to make you believe it's fake, it's fact, but it's really not so factual. Ruby goes right immediately into fiction, and that's what almost there's the Dom DeLillo's book about these, it's great, and then even the Umbrella Academy from a couple of years ago, when they go back to November 22nd, 63, and they actually, I think that's one of the more accurate representations of Jack Ruby. With can I use what? It's a 2-year-old show. Can I reveal the? If you don't want to, spoiler alert, I'm about to spoil the end of the second season of Umbrella Academy. They change history. They stop the assassination. Hence, Jack Ruby doesn't have that. So he's not famous in that way. But the characterization was actually based on what I've seen and read and research, was pretty close to the actual guy.
That's cool.
I'm sorry. So what?
No. I know that was all great. I was just pointing out that movie, and I was going to say the same thing, that Danny Aiello movie is a lot of fiction.
Yeah.
But no, very very, very interesting guy. Of as you say, I mean, kind of a scumbag, but a colorful life for a scumbag.
Look, there's I'm as you may recall, I'm a big Bob Dylan fan, and look, in here in this book that Dylan put out, The Philosophy of Modern Song. I should have this page bookmarked already, but there's it's a book in which Dylan, discusses like 66 different songs. And one of them, well, here's an incredible thing for you, really deep dive.
Yeah, you're solo. No, it's all right. I'm
Here,
soloing on you.
If you know your comics history, here's a woodcut by Lynd Ward, who was an influence on Will Eisner.
Wow.
That's in this Bob Dylan book.
Wow.
But there's a song called Ruby, Ruby, Are You Mad? That has nothing to do with Jack Ruby. It was written, like in the 40s.
Okay.
Let me find it here.
Sure.
Called Ruby, Are You Mad? It's a song that the Osborne brothers sang. I don't even know who the Osborne brothers were, but it's from 1956. And so here, of course, is the famous shot of Ruby and Oswald.
Well, that's the thing. Like, Ruby's back is to us in that infamous picture.
Well, that's it. The most famous thing, and then and Dylan. Dylan is a little bit obsessed with the Kennedy assassination, and
I didn't know that.
And with Ruby, and so he's got that 17-minute song that he put out, "Murder Most Foul." It's all about the Kennedy assassination.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and then there's and then in this book, so it's that's a panel I maybe put into Bob. I'm pitching a panel for the Bob Dylan conference coming up in Tulsa.
That's great.
Spring of Bob Dylan and the Kennedy assassination. Wow. Anyway, so I mean, there's my antenna are obviously up for it because I'm doing this project, but you're right. The most famous thing Jack Ruby ever did, and his back is to the camera. Right. That's so if you believe he did it, and some people do just to be famous, that's. But I mean, the guy's life both before and he lived 3 years after, right? I mean, and
died in prison.
He lived in prison, died in prison. Not only, I mean, you could say about Oswald, well, he never had the chance to talk. You couldn't shut Jack Ruby up, I mean, and apparently nobody tried, but it was, and anyway, that's the story and the book, and I'm so I hope people find that interesting. But,
well, no, man, you got to come back and we'll talk about that book. Okay. But again, we'll remind people that Stanley, A Marvelous Life is out, and you can also get the audio and hear Danny narrate it.
And if you like my older books, I just, even though they're out of print, I hope to get them back in print. But I literally just did audiobooks of Superman on the Couch.
Oh, that's great, man. Here, I'm sorry, blurry picture, but there it is.
Yeah, so there's an audiobook of that. So altogether, if you were trying to figure out, my life is pretty good, but I need another 40 hours of hearing Danny Fingeroth talk, well, those 3 books will solve that problem for you.
Fear not. Exactly. It's all waiting for you on Audible. That's great to hear, man. That's outstanding. No, I'm really glad to hear that, Danny, honestly. And
All
yeah,
right.
here, Michaela says the same thing. The Jack Ruby book sounds amazing.
Oh,
And
thank you, Michaela.
yeah, I hope you get to do the Bob Dylan talk. I think that's really cool. And again, as you say, Will Eisner week coming at the beginning of March.
In March. Go to willeisner.com for more information. And if anybody wants to contact me, Facebook is my main social media, but Danny at DannyFingeroth.com also. So thank you so much. It was great fun to be back.
Always a pleasure, Danny, honestly. And yeah, please, at any time there's something new, I'm always happy to give you the soapbox as Stan would.
Thank you. And I guess we should remember the the premise or the excuse for this episode, which is Happy 100th birthday, Stan Lee.
Absolutely, man. And really, the great thing about Danny's book is you really get a sense of Stan the man. I mean, you really, I think there's some really great intimate memories from Larry and others, and Judith, and Judith Chris talking about the Wortham thing. But I think you'll find some very interesting, unique insight in Danny's book that, again, you don't know the full story if you just know the cliff notes, and you owe it to yourself to read this thing.
Thanks a lot. All right, John. Happy New Year. Happy New Year, everybody.
Hey, stick around just for a second, Danny. I'll tell you something off the air. But everybody, thanks a lot for watching. And great more Word Balloon Live coming next week. Until then, stay safe, stay happy, stay healthy.